Good morning and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, 20 March 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike, and let's get started with Inside the Beltway. First, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said the Trump administration is planning to announce an initiative that's going to modernize U.S. air traffic control. He said this is going to include updating communications infrastructure, moving from copper wire to fiber optic, and also installing new radar systems and terminals for air traffic controllers. But other than that, he did not provide any further details, and the funding for this is dependent on Congress passing additional appropriations. Next, Washington, D.C. District Judge James Boasberg extended the deadline to noon today for the Department of Justice to answer the judge's questions about the timing of deportation flights over the weekend that we've covered earlier this week. The DOJ said in its filing yesterday that it may invoke state secrets privilege to block Boasberg from viewing some information about the deportation flights that were authorized under the Alien Enemies Act. I think what's going on here is the Trump administration is looking for an off-ramp that prevents the perceived constitutional crisis, which is what I think the legal strategy is here against the Trump administration. And last night, Alan Dershowitz, who is a legal scholar and legal analyst, he pointed out that there is no constitutional crisis currently happening, and I thought made a great point that Americans wouldn't believe it if it did, because, quote, CNN and Democrats are crying wolf, which I think points to that this is a deliberate political strategy. And finally, the Trump administration is planning to sign potentially an executive order later today at, I think, 4 p.m. Eastern. That's going to direct Department of Education officials to begin dismantling the Department of Education and, according to the potential executive order, return education authority to the states. As far as hearings, we have no hearings today to cover because Congress is in recess until next week. Moving on to the roll-ups, a group of GOP lawmakers have denounced a proposal for the U.S. to leave NATO leadership. This is coming from House and Senate Armed Services Committee official or GOP lawmakers. And this is based on an article citing an anonymous official, U.S. defense official, saying that the United States is planning to leave or abdicate the NATO allied command. And what I think is going on here is that this is potentially a political information operation designed to break up congressional support for the Trump administration, because that's one of the criticisms coming out from Democrats and progressives over the last month or so is that congressional Republicans have been in, as they say, in lockstep with the Trump administration. I think this is an attempt to break that up. And then moving on, USDA is planning a bird flu vaccine and treatment program. They said the USDA said it's going to announce a $100 million program seeking proposals to prevent, treat, or research bird flu infections in the U.S. poultry industry. They said they're also going to test therapeutic interventions to prevent infections and treat poultry flocks to reduce poultry bird culling, which, if I remember correctly, is now at over 100 million birds have been culled since the beginning of this H5N1 infection. And then Goldman Sachs released an analysis saying that heightened immigration enforcement from the Trump administration, they think, is discouraging foreign-born workers from participating in government surveys that collect employment data. And they said that the immigrant response to employment data surveys has declined in the first 2 months of 2025. As far as I've seen, that actual data impact hasn't hit the Bureau of Labor Statistics yet, and we probably won't see, if it does, probably won't see that until a few months from now, or the next couple of releases of that data. And then finally, in the domestic, and some Korea-based OCI Holdings said it's planning a $265 million solar cell production facility in Texas, and they're using their U.S. subsidiary Mission Solar Energy. They said the operations at this plant are going to begin in 2026, and the reason they're doing this is to build a solar energy supply chain using non-Chinese components. And what I think this ties into, there's this big move from the Trump administration to move back to fossil fuels, or at least reverse a lot of the restrictions the Biden administration implemented on fossil fuels. But why I think this Korean company is trying to build non-Chinese supply chains is because a lot of these countries are dependent on energy imports. And a lot of the support for solar and wind and alternatives to fossil fuels is I think a lot of these countries, including Korea, and I think as we talked about yesterday, Japan, wanting to secure their domestic energy supplies from interference or disruption due to geopolitical events. And related to this, if Jared, you could come on, Taiwan is also talking about buying liquid natural gas from this proposed Alaska energy hub.
Yes, this is a letter coming from Taiwan state-owned corporation for natural gas. They sent a non-binding letter to the Trump administration stating that they would invest in the liquid natural gas projects up in Alaska and also buy LNG from there. And the reason I think it's non-binding, by the way, is that they really can't say they're doing diplomacy, so they have to say it without saying it. And that is what we were expecting out of Taiwan. Basically, everything that runs through Japan from these LNG pipelines would eventually make its way to Korea and to Taiwan and probably the Philippines as well.
Yeah, and this is, I think this energy, this desire of a lot of these, we were talking about this before the show with I forget what's called the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Energy Framework or something like that.
Economic framework.
Framework. Yeah, this idea that there are a lot of our Pacific allies, I think, are getting some political cover now to start looking to the U.S. for not just energy, but also, there's this idea of the China Shock 2.0. And I've seen where some countries like Indonesia there's been starting to be kind of talks about, protectionist policies. And I think these countries are going to start looking to the U.S. more for energy as well.
Yes. And speaking of China and issues from there, China's foreign ministry is urging the United States to protect the rights of Chinese students in America after the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party requested information on Chinese students in STEM programs. Now, the Chinese government is considering this an overstretching of the concept of national security, which these are Chinese students frequently caught sending, the bleeding edge technology back to China and, quote, imposing discriminatory restrictive measures on Chinese students. We talked quite a bit on here about the issues with basically people-to-people exchanges between the United States and China. China has at any given time, I think it's 300,000 to 400,000 students here. And if I remember right, the U.S. has about 1,000 over in China. And the amount of espionage cases that have come out of it is pretty astounding. Moving over to the Middle East, Israel began another ground operation in Gaza last night. This is to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages. And the Arab League issued a call in response to this to resume the ceasefire agreement after an emergency meeting. And lastly, ending up in Europe, the Baltic states and Poland are planning to leave an anti-personnel mine treaty. This is coming from the Polish defense minister. He announced that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Poland would all leave the treaty that bans their use and production. He also said that he expects this to take a while to fully implement. It has to go through government procedure, but he's still commanding his defense industry to begin to at least build the assembly lines for these anti-personnel mines. And notably, Ukraine is part of this treaty and has been for quite some time. And there was a severe lack of anti-personnel mines in 2022. So I think they're trying to prevent, if you remember right, the shot from Russia right toward Kiev in the opening wave. I think they're trying to prevent that, particularly the Baltic states, because they're very small states. Anti-personnel mines would give them significant deterrence and slow down any advances.
Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And first, we are seeing a response from the Trump administration to these attacks on Tesla owners and Tesla dealerships. And this is from Attorney General Pam Bondi, and she released a statement this week through the Department of Justice saying that the, quote, swarm of attacks on Tesla property and targeting of Tesla owners is nothing short of domestic terrorism. And in her statement, she also added the Department of Justice has already charged several perpetrators of these arson attacks with domestic terrorism in mind. and is going to investigate, quote, those operating behind the scenes to coordinate and fund these crimes. So we're seeing this escalation in targeting of Tesla and Tesla owners, Tesla dealerships, charging stations, and I think the idea is that Trump resistance, as Mike and I have talked about, are attempting to disrupt the MAGA coalition by targeting Tesla and Elon Musk, and the idea is to disrupt or project the perception that they are disrupting the crowd of MAGA support. So far, there have been multiple vandalism and arson attacks targeting both individuals and these dealerships. And I also saw early this morning in Oregon, there was also a group of people shot up a Tesla dealership early this morning. Something else that caught my eye is that earlier this month, an executive for Bayer who lives in New Jersey may have also been targeted with an arson attack at his home, because it is now under an arson investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies in New Jersey and New York. And they have allegedly security camera footage of the suspect. I think in general, the level of political tension is rising in the United States, and more politically activated left-wing individuals and groups are using this opportunity to conduct direct actions. I think this is like we thought we saw last year with the pro-Palestine protests. I think this is an organizing opportunity for a lot of these left-wing groups, and they're using these attacks to build momentum, potentially for additional targets, I think, in their, the traditional left-wing target set. So we could see some of these attacks, some of these arson attacks target different, corporations in the case of this Bayer executive. And I think part of this is also being goaded on by some media coverage. I've seen some of these more openly liberal talk show hosts, nighttime show hosts like Jimmy Kimmel and some other media, I think, effectively goading on these actions against Tesla. There was Tim Walz earlier this week who had conducted a rally where he had criticized Tesla and talked about how Tesla stock is going down. And there's also a lot of, I've seen a lot more praise of individuals like Luigi Mangione. So I think this target map we reported on yesterday is an indicator that these direct actions could escalate. They may expand their target set to include traditional targets of left-wing rhetoric. And we also saw later this month, on the 29th of March, there's a Tesla Takedown Global Day of Action planned. So I expect to see activity around these Tesla attacks start to increase as we get closer to that 29 March date. Moving on, Jared, if you could come on, we're going to talk about the Taiwan Quadrennial Defense Review.
Yep. So Taiwan released its final review before the 2027 Chinese military preparedness deadline, which this is a 4-year review. So next one is scheduled to be in 29. We'll see. We'll have to see where that goes. So Taiwan intends to run a whole of nation defense concept, including mass mobilization, civil military integration, countering gray zone tactics, which would be things like the Chinese maritime militia, the fishing fleets, and what we've seen where a lot of people pretend to be defectors from China come over and turns out they're military intelligence, and running messaging operations on Taiwan's own people. So in what that would be is basically counter messaging operations, saying, hey, to prevent the Chinese ops. And the government is also going to seek a regional collective deterrence, which includes more military cooperation with the United States, amongst others. Now, we covered earlier this month a U.S. Navy Institute law professor saying, hey, our Pacific allies treat the gray zone as warfare. We need to worry about collective defense. I understand there are International Court of Justice rulings saying that, that this really doesn't quite exist for the gray zone. Just ignore those and move forward. Here we see Taiwan really taking that to heart and beginning to implement it, because they're explicitly calling out Chinese gray zone tactics and treating that as a method of warfare. And I think due to that, and especially the fact that they're calling out collective deterrence, which that same professor said was ruled against in Latin America for the United States, what Taiwan is trying to do here is say, we need to move forward with it regardless. And I think that's going to result in a couple of interesting things. First off, Taiwan's going to test its whole concept here in the first week of April and over in July on their annual Han Kuang exercises. I think we're going to see concurrent or near concurrent regional partner exercises in order to kind of covertly test the integration process. In addition to that, China is obviously going to respond to these. I expect, again, near concurrent exercises from the Chinese, and probably very large exercises at that. And in addition to that, the Chinese this is likely going to color the Chinese diplomacy for the next couple of years. This is particularly so depending on the regional participation in these upcoming exercises. If Japan and the United States are very overtly involved, China's going to take a great offense to that, because this is effectively Taiwan practicing for an independence run.
So, we've talked about this 2027 date, and that your analysis is pointed to it's much more. It's unlikely to happen that they take whatever action on Taiwan by 2027. Do you think we'll start to see more ramping up of a lot of this gray zone activity in the Pacific? Because I know you've also reported on, like in the Philippines, there's a lot of Chinese involvement in criminal networks activity there that are also used for espionage.
Yes, I do expect plenty of that. That's where China really excels, is doing things that are not quite warfare but are still very openly hostile. That's I would expect a lot more gray zone activity from them. Things like the ramming we see down in the Philippines, a lot more incursion attempts and testing defenses around Taiwan, testing response times, checking all of it. And one of the things that they did last year that they're not doing this year so far, they'd had a continuous presence around the Senkakus. I could definitely see them, particularly if Japan, who is the most vocal in support of Taiwan in the region. If Japan is involved, I could see China actually stepping in and saying, "Hey, we're going to patrol the Senkakus again," and really try to enforce our territorial claim on them.
So, speaking of the ship ramming and increasing, these the kind of gray zone tactics, even if given that the 2027 date seems to be out of the question for now, do you think China could still attempt to use things like these ship rammings to provide an excuse to take some kind of military action? Because I think it was last year you said that if there was something to kick off before heading into 2027, it would be between China and somebody like the Philippines.
Can you clarify that for me? Like, it sounds like you're asking, could China run a false flag?
Well, I don't mean a false flag necessarily, but if they were to ram another Philippine Coast Guard ship or get into some kind of situation like that again, do you think they could use that as an excuse to ramp up military activity, potentially causing some kind of crisis?
Potentially. I don't think it's in China's interest, though, because the main reason I think that the 2027 deadline is not going to happen is that the anti-China coalition appears solid enough that I don't think that China can overcome it. So for China to escalate post-crash would be still a losing proposition, and one that they did not get to choose the beginning phases of, which they will need to do if they intend to win at all. I think it's much more likely that they're going to try to get as close as they can to the line without crossing it, which Taiwan treating the gray zone as warfare, as recommended by Professor Kraska, is really going to upset that ability.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers. And our first question from Zobozo Shizion. What do you think will be in the JFK Epstein releases? Well, I haven't taken a deep dive into the JFK releases, which is I think 500 something documents. But from what I have seen, there's no smoking gun there. And the Epstein thing coming out of the DOJ, that's things that were redacted that are already publicly available. I think a lot of I don't think you're going to find necessarily a smoking gun in any of these documents. And I think, as I said before with the Epstein thing, if there does exist some client list that would cause a major political shakeup in the United States, it's probably not in in the hands of Pam Bondi. All right. Also from Zabozo Shizion, Thomas Massey noted that the military industrial complex is looking for a war to ignite demand, and as the Houthi piracy crackdown is inauspicious. I like Thomas Massey, but I don't think necessarily they're looking for a war to ignite demand. There is demand. The problems that the defense industrial base, the problems with the defense industrial base that these defense industry representatives have said in Congress is that it's not that there's low demand for munitions per se. It's that there are policy issues that create barriers to like expanding production. So one of those being the short-term contracts for munitions production. So like there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty, as they would say, over actually expanding munitions production. Frozen Nomad asks, to what degree has Russia been holding back militarily in the Ukraine war, and what is the strength of their military now compared to before the war, which I think is a question that is directed at Jared.
Okay. So militarily, I believe they're stronger. Their industrial base is pretty well kicked off. They've fielded a few extra weapons that were only in production or only in development at the time. So I think they are technically stronger, but to the degree that they're holding back, I am not sure. That really needs to be studied at a high level to figure out, and with Russia's cooperation, to figure out, okay, were they actually held back? Were they holding back? What was the deal? From what I can tell, it does appear that air supremacy has been unachievable for both sides. So to some degree, they are being held back and not simply holding back. Because Russia, if Russia was holding itself back, you would expect to see air supremacy in some regions, and as far as I know, that has not been achieved. And part of that's the advent of small tactical level drone warfare, I think is the right way to put it. Not necessarily small scale.
Yeah, I think there's also, looking at the stated objective, at least of this, what Russia calls the special military operation, was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. So I don't think it's necessarily in their interest to. I think they could, if they wanted to, just completely invade and take over Kiev and take control of the Ukrainian state. But I don't think that's their goal. They want a buffer between NATO and Russia, so that wouldn't meet their stated goal. However, that doesn't mean that necessarily they're holding back from doing that. Like you said, there's a lot of issue. There's signs that Russia may not be holding back because of they can't get air dominance. But like you said, this is also basically going to be dependent on a post-mortem after we get a peace deal and get potentially academics and defense analysts get access to internal Russian documents, if they ever do. All right, from Bad Wabbit, adding to FN's question, what is their military production, ammunitions production levels in comparison to before the war? Well, I think it's they have gone into basically a war economy, and that was actually part of one of the indicators that they're serious about a peace deal, is that they're talking about reprivatizing a lot of that industry. But if I remember correctly, they were having no or very minimal issues with keeping up with like defense munitions production. Compared to Ukraine and like the United States, which, as we've said many times, has had issues ramping up that production, and is I think Ukraine was at one point in the war early on, Ukraine was firing as many artillery shells per day as we produce per month, and really putting down their stockpiles to the point that I saw reports that like they had really cut back on their use of artillery because of that, because they were, the production couldn't keep up. While Russia, meanwhile, has pretty well endured a lot of the sanctions leveled against them and really ramped up their war production.
Yep. All right. The next question is actually from Ben T. And it's Naib Bukili said, sorry, I think I may have butchered that name, said in an ex post that the U.S. is facing a judicial coup. El Salvador experienced the same thing and enacted emergency powers to deal with it. Will we see similar action in the United States?
I don't think so. I think the Trump administration is trying to get the Supreme Court to, one, overturn some precedent that has, in the Trump administration's view, weakened executive power, like the Humphreys executor versus U.S. case that made it effectively so they could, the White House can't fire members of independent agencies, like heads of independent agencies. And I think they're also trying to get, as fast as they can, some kind of decision from the Supreme Court on these nationwide injunctions. And so it's a fight over jurisdiction of the lower level courts. I don't think the Trump administration is going to declare some kind of emergency powers to just ignore the courts. There's the potential. I think this case over the Enemy Aliens Act is if there is a case where the Trump administration will be effectively forced to defy the courts or comply and undermine their agenda, I think it's this case. But they are trying their best not to do that, because I think they see that as a potential political loser, or at least could be taken advantage of politically. So they're trying their best not to openly defy the courts or do something to undermine the authority of the courts necessarily. All right. Well, if that is the end of our questions for today, that will do it for the morning briefing. We'll see you tomorrow at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.